He screamed, he yelled, he tried to drag her out. He ran back and got his father. His father came out, they dragged her out. She's extremely dead. That suspicious death went through to the keeper. But his gloating didn't last because he got cancer, which tells you that not all debts are paid with money. That is just another case of many real dead housewives. I'm Andrew Rule, this is Life and Crimes. Today we're going on a journey down memory lane, and I think we'll give it the title for today of not just the real housewives of Melbourne, but the real dead housewives of Greater Melbourne, and by that I mean Victoria. Let's run through a few well-known ones and a few that aren't as well-known. Dedicated listeners will recall that they've heard some of these stories before, in part or in full, but that's okay. Who doesn't like hearing them again in some detail? Now, of course, most of our listeners will recall the Jennifer Tanner case. The Tanner case is one that came to light in the mid-1990s, but it concerned the death in a farmhouse at Bonnie Doon up near Mansfield back in late 1984, the death of Jennifer Tanner. Jennifer Tanner was a young mother. She had one young son called Sam. She was married to a guy called Laurie Tanner, who was a farmer and shearer and truck driver up around the Mansfield area. The Tanners were a very well-known old family up there, had been there since the Kelly era back in the 1870s, even before, and were a pretty well-known family. And on this particular night, Laurie Tanner had gone into Mansfield to pick up bread and milk and stuff, and his wife, Jennifer, had seemed quite happy. When he left, she said, "Oh, bring me back a surprise," meaning, an ice cream or whatever. And he left her there, and apparently she'd been fairly happy in her house with her 18-month-old child or whatever he was, just a toddler, because she'd made a cup of coffee and a biscuit, and she had the television on, and she had the little boy all new nappy on him and all that sort of stuff, and she'd put him down in his cot to sleep. And at some point, while halfway through a cup of coffee and halfway through a biscuit, it would appear, if you believe some people, that she went and fetched her husband's .22 rifle that he used to shoot rabbits and foxes. She did know how to use the rifle because he'd once shown her how to use it, but she wasn't a keen user of guns and didn't like them much. She'd grown up inside the town of Mansfield. She hadn't grown up using guns. And apparently she decided to shoot herself in the middle of her cup of coffee and her biscuit. And not only she shot herself once, it turned out that she was found with 2 bullets in her forehead, and that she'd been shot through the webbing of her fingers and hands, almost as if, some people later thought, she had defence wounds. It looked really, to a lot of people, as if she'd held her hands up in front of her face to stop herself being shot by someone else. And that's the way it looked, which is why an open finding was subsequently made by a coroner. But many years after that, a new inquest was called as a result of the pressure that built up after a story which I wrote in 1996, I think it was, which highlighted the very strange and suspicious and sinister aspects of that case. And, a story which pointed out that Laurie Tanner, her husband, had in fact been married before, and the family, the old Tanner farming family, had had to pay out that wife when she decided to leave Laurie. She was a school teacher up that way, and she said, "I'm leaving and I want my half of the farm," or whatever. They had to raise money and pay her out in cash in order that Laurie kept the family farm. And there is a strong thought that the family was afraid that Jennifer, the second wife, was also going to leave Laurie, and that this time the farm would have to be sold and they'd lose it after generations. And it was suggested by some that this was a motive for someone in the family to kill Jennifer rather than see her take any chance of divorcing Laurie. And subsequently, a coroner at the second inquest, which was held in the late 90s, and this inquest was not held in a church hall in Mansfield as the first one was. This one was held at the coroner's court in Melbourne. And at this second inquest, the then coroner decided that after looking at all the evidence, including the fact that Jennifer's brother-in-law, a serving policeman, Dennis Tanner, had not given any evidence on the grounds that it might incriminate him, the coroner declared that Jennifer Tanner had been shot to death by her brother-in-law, Dennis Tanner. Now, no charges were laid because indeed there was at that distance no smoking gun. The old Tanner house sadly had been burnt down on a cold spring night when no one was in the house and no fires were going, which was strange. And with that apparent arson, any potential clues that might have helped the homicide squad come to a correct conclusion were lost. And barring some form of deathbed confession, it is unlikely that anybody will ever be charged over the death of Jennifer Tanner. And we'll be back after this. Jennifer Tanner is just one of many cases that come to mind. And in no particular order, let's run through a few of them. Nancy K. King. Nancy K. King died in 1991, in June 1991, very wet winter up around Shepparton. She was out at Tallygaroopna, which is out of Shep, between there and Cobram, I think. And Nancy, or Kay, they called her Kay. Kay was a lovely woman. She had 4 sporty, good-looking kids, born very close together. Her husband was a man called Graham King. Now, Graham King was a bit of a local football hero in the sense that he had been a very fine footballer when he'd grown up around the Bacchus Marsh area. And, in fact, he'd been a ruckman. He was a big, strong man. But he'd suffered a bad head injury on the football field as a young man, and that prevented him from going on with his football career, which probably would have ended up with him rucking for St Kilda alongside the famous Carl Dittrich, Big Carl. And Graham King was sufficiently big and strong and fast and skillful that he probably would have been a very fine VFL footballer had he not been injured. Some say that after that injury, that head injury, he was a different man, that he had very bad flashes of temper, and there had been occasions at family gatherings where he had lost his temper, and he'd once picked up his brother-in-law by the throat with one hand, which was very distressing for the other members of the family at Christmas that particular year. But it showed how strong he was, how potentially violent he was, and that he had this bizarrely bad temper. Up on the farm at Tallygaroopna, where they milked and bred Ayrshire cattle, Graham became heavily involved in local football. He was a bit of a standout around the Shepparton Bush League because he would coach and teach people how to play footy, and he was, a bit of a big deal in the local football scene. And because of that, he was well known by a lot of people, the sort of people that follow local footy clubs, which is sort of half the district. And he was well known by local police around Shepparton, who many of them were heavily involved in the local footy league because their kids played or they'd played themselves in the past. And so he was a really well-known figure. And so when his wife, Nancy K. King, was found drowned on their farm on a winter's afternoon in 1991, the fact that the circumstances were a bit cloudy didn't really filter through to the police in time for a proper investigation. What happened was Graham King, it turned out, had been having an affair with a woman neighbour, and he'd been over visiting that woman when he looked up mid-afternoon and said, "Oh, I think the cows at home have got out," or something like that. "I can see the cows at home. They might be getting into the haystack." And this was amazing that he could see across a couple of kilometres of flat country so clearly. But anyway, he jumped in his car and he drove back to his own farm, and indeed the cattle were milling around the haystack. And then he says he got his son Peter, one of his 4 children, he got his son Peter to go out and chase the cattle and look for his wife and Peter's mother, Kay. He said, "Where's Mum? She's not here. You better see if she's over near the haystack." A strange sort of order to give to a teenage boy. But anyway, the teenage boy, Peter, goes out and he sees the cattle milling around, and then he sees his mother's gumboots sticking out of what has often been called a well. Now, it wasn't strictly a well. It was a sump. It was a sump about 6 foot deep, so a very shallow well, in the bottom of a concrete pen that had once been an old pig pen. And what they used to do when they built pig pens was build these concrete sumps so that all the slush and manure and urine would run to the centre of the pen and down into this concreted hole and then would be drained away elsewhere. This hole would fill with water in winter, which it was when there was plenty of rain, and that is where Peter found his mother, because he could see the gumboots sticking out of the hole. He could see the dirty water, and he could see that his mother was headfirst in the hole, drowned. He screamed, he yelled, he tried to drag her out. He ran back and got his father. His father came out. They dragged her out. She's extremely dead. They call an ambulance. Of course, she's dead. Nancy King is dead. Her children are totally shocked and horrified, of course. But one thing that Peter noticed was that his mother's nice new gumboots, which had sort of pink or red soles, were totally clean. And this was unusual because the area around the sump and around the cow yard and around the house yard generally was extremely muddy and extremely wet. And it seemed strange later that her boots were clean. And in fact, some people might have thought later that perhaps she'd been carried across to the sump by a big, strong man and poked head down into the sump. And there were some things about her death that just didn't gel. Her oldest son, Jason, was then 18. He was an apprentice signwriter in Melbourne when he got a call to say, "You better get home, something bad's happened to Mum." And he and a friend speed up the highway from Melbourne to the farm. And when he gets there, he finds the house full of people. There are dozens and dozens of neighbours and friends and football club members. There's, I think, maybe one local policeman. And the body has been taken away by the ambulance to Shepparton, of course. And Jason can't really work out what's gone on, but he knows it's suspicious because, or he suspects it might be because he knows, being the oldest, he's been a great confidant of his mother's. He realises that his parents weren't getting along well. He realises that his father is probably having an affair. He realises that his father is sometimes violent and acts badly and bizarrely. And he knew that his mother was planning to leave his father. He also knew that his mother had come into a $60,000 compensation payment for an injury she'd suffered to one of her arms, and that this $60,000 payment, in 1991, which is 30 years ago, was quite a sum of money when you were a broke dairy farmer's wife in rural Victoria looking for a way out. It was quite a sum of money. But he also knew that the farm and his father owed quite a bit of money because of the effect of drought and so on. They owed a lot of money for fodder and so forth, and that the $60,000 could be used to square the debts. And Jason realised that there was a ready-made scenario that looked rather sinister. But it would appear, ladies and gentlemen, that local police who were friendly with Graham King decided in their wisdom that there was nothing to see here. Now, I don't believe that they were a party to a murder plot. I just believe that they thought they took it at face value. I know at least two of those policemen, one of them no longer with us, and I think they took it at face value initially and thought that, the cattle had, as Graham said, the cows that must have knocked her into the sump and she's drowned. And they believed it, and they believed it long enough to tell the homicide squad when they were called that that was probably the scenario. And this accidental death scenario persisted long enough that, interestingly, a homicide squad detective who probably should have known better was not all that welcoming of the news from the pathologist in Melbourne. I think it was Shelley Robertson, the pathologist in Melbourne, who said, there's something a bit strange about this. There's some thumb marks on this woman's neck, or they look like finger marks or thumb marks, as if she's been held by the throat. And there were other indicators that led her to have an open mind about what had caused her death. And the pathologist certainly believed that there was room for conjecture, and she told the homicide squad detective this. She says that he said something like, "We are the homicide squad, not the almost homicide squad," and that without the pathologist actually finding that there was a suspected homicide, that they weren't going to pursue it. Now, why that would be, I don't know, but it might be a mixture of motives. It might have been that it was a wet, stinking, terrible, muddy place, and when the police got there, it was already far too late to find any clues that would matter. The crime scene, if it was one, had been totally ruined by the fact that 50 strangers had trooped around the house and around the house yard and around the sump. They really didn't have much to go on, and it was easier to go along with the local police who said, look, Graham's a good bloke and it's just a terrible accident and we don't want to stress him out. He's got 4 kids to look after, blah, blah, blah. And so that suspicious death went through to the keeper. And it went through to the keeper for many years, I think maybe 14 years, something like that, until Jason contacted one of the local police at Shepparton. Jason, by this stage, is, living, I think, might have been interstate, might have been in Sydney. He had a pretty good job. He had kids of his own. And he went back to Shepparton, where I think 2 of his siblings were living. And he saw a former sergeant of police there that he knew, Ken Mansell. Ken Mansell had been a sergeant back when Nancy had died on the farm. He hadn't had a direct involvement, but he had always found it a little bit puzzling. And when Jason came to him, Ken Mansell was no longer a policeman, and he agreed that it didn't really stack up. It did look a bit suspicious. And his advice to Jason King was to go to a particular member of the media, and that, as it happens, was me, because I had written stories about the Medill Haywood murders in Shepparton many years earlier, and Ken Mansell, the policeman, had been heavily involved in investigating those murders, and he had sort of befriended me in the process of me writing a book about those murders, and he suggested to Jason, go and see this bloke Rule, and he did, and subsequently I wrote a long and involved story about the death of Kay King and the distress and suspicion felt by her adult children. And subsequently, Graham King, her husband, who'd sold the farm and moved away, and attempted to use his dead wife's engagement ring to give to another woman who wasn't impressed with it. He was subsequently charged and tried for murder. On the first occasion, there was a hung jury because the jury couldn't make up its mind. On the second occasion that he was tried, the jury, I think, looked like being hung again, split. I won't bore you with all the details, but there was some pretty good evidence. One of them was from a dancer in a local strip club Shepparton, who said that a farmer called Graham King had come in and talked to her about the death of his wife and so on. It was quite damning evidence in its way. But anyway, the jury in the second trial also looked like disagreeing over a verdict, and I think that the judge instructed them that he didn't want another hung jury and that they'd better reach a verdict, and they went back and they considered their verdict for a long time in the jury room before finally coming up with a acquittal, a not guilty verdict. And that reminds me of something that we've said on this podcast before, and that was when Greg Demazovic was acquitted of the death, homicide of little Jaden Lesky at Moe. And when his very fine barrister, Colin Lovett, was approached outside the court by a young reporter who said, "Oh, Mr. Lovett, what's it like to have your client found innocent?" Colin Lovett turned to the reporter and said, "My dear, my client has not been found innocent. My client has been found not guilty, which is a very different thing." And I suspect that that is what the barrister representing Graham King might have been able to say had he been asked. We'll never know. But that is just another case of many real dead housewives. There is the case, now almost forgotten, of the disappearance of a former television model called Jackie Ramchin. Now, Jackie, she was a tall and glamorous woman. She'd appeared on television quiz shows, I think the one with Tony Barber, Sale of the Century. And she worked in TV and modelling. And she married a man called Vic Ramchin. And Vic Ramchin, whose real name was much longer and more complex, he was an Eastern European man, a very clever guy who I think might have been an architect or that sort of thing. A very successful man in his business. They owned a double-storey prestigious house in, I think, the Main Road, South Yarra. And they lived there with their two good-looking, tall, beautiful children who were smart, good at school. And it turned out that Mrs. Ramchin, she had retained her looks and her zest for life. And it appeared that she had many friends outside the marriage and apparently was conducting one or two affairs with people she'd met possibly through school, where she used to drop the kids at school or whatever. And she was wanting to leave the marriage and get a divorce, and that this was going to cost a lot of money because the house in South Yarra was worth a lot of money, and the Ramchins also owned a property up around the Woodend area, not Mount Macedon, but I think Woodend. And it was a nice country property with a nice house and all the rest of it. And Vic Ramchin was a fair bit older than his wife, and he'd made quite a lot of money before he met her, and it would appear to suspicious police that it was very convenient for him that at the very time when his wife declares that she wants to leave and wants a divorce and therefore wants half of everything, that she vanishes. Because Jackie Ramchin dropped her kids off at school on April the 10th, 1992, at one of the local private schools on the south side of the river, and she was never seen again. And the police certainly believed, and we can say this with absolute confidence, the police certainly believed that she'd met foul play, and she'd probably met foul play somewhere around the house in South Yarra and probably been taken to the property, which was probably big enough that she could be disposed of, if not on the actual property, then nearby or somewhere up there in a district that Vic Ramchin knew well. Possibly with the assistance of one of his friends, maybe. I think one of his friends was found with an unregistered .25 caliber pistol, which was of interest to the police, that it was hidden in a cellar. But long story short, they couldn't make it stick. About 9 years later, they charged Victor Ramchin with murder. It was basically thrown out because there was no smoking gun, no evidence. It was just a circumstantial case, a very good circumstantial case, but that's all it was. They really had nothing to show that she couldn't have just vanished, arranged her own exit from Australia. Somehow she was well connected. She had friends and contacts and possibly relatives in Hong Kong, and she had former lovers and boyfriends here, there and everywhere. And it was conceivable, although unlikely, that she might have faked her own disappearance and vanished, thereby leaving behind half of a considerable fortune and her children. And so there is no real doubt that she was murdered, that she met foul play and disposed of. And we can say that because a year after his acquittal, Vic Ramchen died of cancer. Not before getting in touch with one of the lead investigators, Charlie Bazina of the Homicide Squad, on the occasion when I think his eldest son might have topped the HSC or VCE results in Victoria. I think Ramchen's older son had done extremely well in his exams, and his father, Vic Ramchen, was very proud of him, and I think he'd always pursued the view with the police that, you know, his wife was a scatterbrain, his wife was a bad influence on the kids. She was a sort of mother who would vanish and disappear and run away, and they were better off without her, etc., etc., etc. And when this son topped these exams, he couldn't resist ringing Charlie Bazina to tell him about it, and sort of in a quiet and discreet way gloat. But his gloating didn't last because he got cancer, which tells you that not all debts are paid with money. And we'll be back after this to finish our story. And that's all for this week, but next week we're going to return with more true stories of the real dead housewives of Melbourne, by which I mean Victoria. Thanks for listening. Life and Crimes is a Sunday Herald Sun production for True Crime Australia. Our producer is Jonty Burton. If you like the show, leave a 5-star rating and a review wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to know more about these stories, links are in the description of this episode.